Hello and welcome to the August 15th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Romeo and beside me is my colleague Anthony Bardaway.
Hello, everybody.
Before we kick off into the latest developments on the full-scale invasion, I'd like to remind our listeners that if you like our content and you would like to see more of it, you can support us at Patreon/Ukraine Without Hype. Every dollar is incredibly valued, and we really appreciate the support. Now, before we get into the news of the day, I took a weekend trip to Odessa. It's a kind of family tradition for me, my wife, and a couple of family friends of ours to head down to Odessa every summer, like I would say a good portion of Ukraine does. But obviously, during wartime, with Odessa being such a prominent target, things are a little different, but not as different as you might think. Odessa itself is still the same kind of raucous, touristy party city that it's always been. The hotel actually that we were staying at has a bar attached to the property, and it was the first time since the start of the full-scale invasion, so almost 3 years, that I was able to drink at a bar after midnight, and boy did I take advantage of that. It was a glorious feeling. The weekend was mostly peaceful. We were targeted by ballistics a couple of times, and the main thing that I noticed, the main difference between being under an air alert in Kyiv and being under an air alert in Odessa is that there's a lot less lead time between the air raid alert going off and the booms of strikes or interceptions. The weekend I was there, we had air alerts twice, and both times we had interceptions, audible interceptions, within seconds of the air raid alert going off. But the people are completely unbothered. Odessites have adapted to this kind of situation. The beaches are full, the restaurants are full, people are out in the streets. When the air raid goes off, people still continue their normal lives. So much like the rest of Ukraine, no one's really allowed these air raids to define how they live. And generally, they still maintain that carefree Odessa attitude, even despite the fact that they are, within kind of 30 seconds of strike range of ballistic missiles and within range of a lot of other Russian weapons and is the target of Russian weapons. But Odessa stands strong and it maintains its sense of humor. And I think that's an important lesson to take back as the war continues to drag on. But with my Odessa trip and that relaxing period out of the way, we can turn our focus back to the ongoing Russian invasion, of course, the massive changes that have occurred in the war over the past few weeks. Anthony, what's the biggest thing that's changed?
Well, this is going to be a very battle-heavy episode. We're going to have a little bit of a breather at the end to talk about the Olympics that just closed off, but we're going pretty much just straight warfare this episode other than that. So we'll begin by talking about some of the deep strikes that have been occurring of Ukraine attacking Russian air bases as well as some special forces assaults before getting into the big news story of the week, which is Ukraine launching an invasion of the Russian mainland, the actual country of Russia, not just the territories that it occupies in Ukraine, but Russia. Then transferring from there into the various battlefield changes that have taken place elsewhere, which has largely been around the New York-Toretsk region as well as Pokrovsk, which is not as good of news as the rest of the episode, I'm afraid, but we'll be getting into that later on. So talking about these deep strikes, Ukraine has had a strategy over most of this war of targeting Russian airfields. And in the lead up to targeting Russian airfields with missiles and drone attacks. And in the lead up to the invasion of Russia, we saw Ukraine getting a lot more active in these attacks. On August 3rd, there was an attack on Motorzovsk Air Base where Ukraine was able to hit the weapons warehouses. Some of the news said that Ukraine attacked the airstrip, but wasn't quite that. It was the warehouses holding weapons and ammunition that were completely leveled. There was satellite imagery of after this attack and several buildings that were at one point full of ammunition that would have been fired at Ukrainians instead turned the base into a smoking crater. And there are a few other attacks around that time leading up to the invasion on August 6th. Also, yesterday, as of recording yesterday, the night of the 13th and 14th, 4 separate air bases were hit throughout Russia that would have been able to supply some kind of reinforcement and support for any Russian defenders in the Kursk region. Again, destroyed. A lot of bombers were hit as well, including the aircraft that would have been used to drop glide bombs on any Ukrainian forces or positions. But besides this rather large outbreak of Russian air bases that went up in smoke, there's also a special forces attack on the Kinburn Spit. So for this, I would like you to maybe peep at Google Maps for a second and scroll down to where the Dnipro River empties into the Black Sea. Where the Dnipro River comes out, we have Mykolaiv next to Kherson before leading past Odessa, and there's this bay there, this bay that the Dnipro leads into is right next to a nature preserve. This is not very developed land. It is before the war. Anyway, this was meant for camping and, getting out into nature, that kind of thing. But now it is used by the Russians to block off any sea traffic that might get into Kherson and Mykolaiv. So this area is not super heavily fortified, but it is enough of a problem that makes the ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson unusable. So Ukrainian special forces and Marines launched an amphibious attack onto Kinburn Spit, part of this area. A spit is like it's like a tiny little thin peninsula that they were able to launch an assault on, took out a couple of dozen Russian soldiers as well as equipment before withdrawing. Now, if the Russians will tell you what happened, they'll say that this entire landing force was destroyed and they thoroughly humiliated the best of the Ukrainian forces in their ridiculous assault. And we'll talk about how Russia has been fibbing quite a lot like this recently. But we know that this can't really be true because this force did return home and were able to report on the strike that they carried out. Will this strike be able to completely dislodge the Russians from this area and open up the Mykolaiv port? Probably not, but it is important to keep up pressure on this area to prevent them from being able to fortify as much as possible. And I think another reason why this assault may have occurred is, well, a lot of these assaults have occurred, but in this case, especially because of the loss of Kursk on the opposite side of the Dnipro River and the River War campaign that we've been talking about, the Marines needed to have their own victories, and I think this counts. It's a bit of a Parthian shot as they were leaving Kursk to still be able to attack the Russians and not let them think that just because they're able to dislodge the Kursk assault that they have full command of the waters there. But now for our big story, which of course is what everyone wants to hear about, which is the invasion of Kursk Oblast by Ukraine that began on August 6th, so going on about a week now. On August 6th, Ukrainian forces were able to break through the Russian border guards on the border between Sumy Oblast and Kursk Oblast. The Russian defenses vanished pretty much right away, and we'll go and talk a little bit about why in a minute. But from there, they're able to rapidly take Russian positions and Russian towns consistently, day after day, until at this point, Ukraine controls about 1,000 kilometers of territory within Russia, along with dozens of towns centered on the city of Sudzha. We don't particularly know the details of what's going on there. It is very, very secretive, except for what they allow to get out. And again, lots of topics that talk about this. But what we do know is that there have not been many Russian defenses in this area, and that Ukraine has had fairly free reign there for a number of days. They are now running into more defenses from the Russians. There is a bit more resistance to the Ukrainians, and it's to be expected that that resistance will increase as time goes on. However, the Ukrainians do still have the advantage, and they still are. I just saw that another 3 towns were taken over. What you are seeing on the maps, and we always refer to these maps, will not be accurate. And no two maps are the same. The reason for this being that Ukraine isn't necessarily taking and holding territory, though that may be what happens in the future. But right now they're still in the phase of seeing how far they can go until they are stopped. And however far that is, it's being marked down on the maps. So there may not be an actual garrison in some town that's being marked, but Ukraine is able to operate that far at least. This is very reminiscent of what the Russians were doing in Sumy Oblast at the beginning of the invasion. A lot of the time, they did not exactly sit and hold a town, but there was a large amount of the countryside they had essentially free reign over, and that's kind of where we're at in the opposite direction. As of right now, I'd say that their goals are being mostly opportunistic. We don't know what the actual goal of this operation is. They've not said so yet. But by tracing out what they're doing, it seems as though the Ukrainians are just taking what they can grab. When they started to hit more resistance going northwards towards the city of Kursk, and especially the Kursk nuclear power plant, which may be one of the goals, possibly. When they started to meet resistance going towards Kursk, they instead turned southwards and eastwards and westwards to spread out more along the border and take more territory that way, not slowing down so much and getting bogged down heading straight towards Kursk, but doing whatever they can grab.
There is also the issue of the railway line in Kursk Oblast, specifically the Lvov railway line. Lvov is a town to the west of Kursk itself, and it represents a kind of vital railway link for Russian supplies going into Belgorod, which is, of course, the main kind of supply point for their Donbass offensives. It is incredibly likely that Ukraine will attempt or has attempted or has established control, or at least fire control, over the railway station and the lines running through that portion, the kind of southern Ukrainian-bound portion of Kursk Oblast. Obviously, if Ukraine can establish control over this very critical train line, the Russian supply situation in Belgorod will be quite precarious. But again, as the military is staying tight-lipped, and we'll go into that a little later on, it's difficult to say for sure.
Yeah, it seems as though the main Russian defenses are being put up now to defend the Kursk nuclear power plant. There is this nuclear power plant that's very, very close to the border. There are some speculations that if Ukraine is able to hold this power plant, they'll be able to basically trade it for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and get rid of that problem that we've talked so much about. Again, that's all speculation. Who knows what the actual goals are? Though I did see a sushi restaurant in your city there, Vinnytsia, that was offering 5 kilograms worth of sushi to the first unit that enters the Kursk nuclear power plant, which kind of gets into this morale question that we're definitely going to get into.
Ukrainians really love sushi. I think it came into the top 10 countries that love sushi. Ukraine's up there. So hopefully that's positive motivation for the boys on the ground there.
That's the bonus. But because we can't have much talk about as far as operation goes, we can't break down the strategy and the tactics that they're using. We can't say how fast they're going to be able to take these towns because it's all secretive. We'll get into some of the topics that this invasion has brought up around it. And I've kind of divided these topics into things that we have to look at from the Ukrainian side as well as the Russian side. So the first question that comes up there is, how is this even possible? When Russia was able to launch an invasion of Kharkiv Oblast, they were met with resistance and severe resistance by the Ukrainians and were ground down in some of these cities to the point where, this incursion into Kursk Oblast has already taken more ground than the Russian invasion into Kharkiv Oblast. Kharkiv Oblast was fortified. Why was Kursk Oblast on the other side of the border in Russia not fortified that allowed this to happen?
Now, one of the kind of answers to this is because the Russians simply didn't expect it. Border units in Russia are controlled by the FSB, not the military. And as we've talked about before, the FSB and the military have a pretty big rivalry, especially lately with Putin viewing the military as failures and leaning on the FSB more to provide more accurate intelligence than he receives from Army Command. Of course, we've also discussed the so-called accuracy of FSB intelligence before. On top of that, Ukraine has tested the waters, so to say. We've seen earlier incursions by, well, what Ukraine claims are pro-Ukrainian Russian units like the Russian Volunteer Legion, the RDK. They have previously gone into Belgorod and occupied villages there, though those were always raids. They go in, they do something, and then they leave. But these incursions, plus Ukrainian reconnaissance, were kind of a way to show that the Russian defenses in that sector were not that hard. In Belgorod, the defenses are a lot tougher to get through. That's why we haven't seen any capture of territory there. But in Kursk, reconnaissance apparently found little to no resistance, and that's what we've seen. Russia simply didn't build fortifications there despite it being on the border, or whatever fortifications that were encountered were undermanned and easily overrun, allowing Ukraine basically to operate freely. This is in stark contrast to the tactics used by the Russian invasion forces at the start of the full-scale invasion, when they just lined up in convoys and started driving down the main highways to Kyiv. Ukrainian command has not done that. They've been sort of ranging around and seeing how far they can push the Russian defenses or where they touch Russian resistance, and then they will simply go another way, as Anthony mentioned earlier. Because this is getting pretty deep into Russian territory, you can sort of drive around. If there are no soldiers around, there's no military resistance, there's nothing to stop you. And this allows you to simply roll into whatever village it is and plant a flag and say hi to the locals, tell them to prepare for referendum. So it seemed like this has primarily been enabled by a lack of Russian intelligence, a lack of Russian preparation, inter-service rivalry between the FSB and the military, and a lack of foresight on the Russians' part. Just like the French never expected the Germans to bypass the Maginot Line, well, the Russians apparently never expected the Ukrainians to go through Kursk Oblast.
And another reason is that a lot of these border troops are just not very well equipped or very well trained. And though we've often talked about Russian soldiers as being, zombies that march forward, that's still something. They get some amount of equipment. These border soldiers are often people serving in their mandatory military service. Russia has mandatory military service. Ukraine has, even before the full-scale invasion mobilization, there was mandatory service. And part of the deal that you had was if you were there as a mandatory service, because you're told to be there, then you're not deployed to combat. In Ukraine, what this meant was that people who were only serving mandatory service were not sent to Donbass. They were not sent into combat, which is why a lot of the people defending Kyiv in the initial siege were lower trained mandatory units that were defending the various airports around the city, for example. Hostomel in particular stands out because that's who was defending Hostomel. Russia here is same idea. They are not the best equipped units. They are there because they have to, and they did not exactly have the strongest esprit de corps. If they had wanted to take part in the invasion of Ukraine, they would have signed on. They would have signed the papers to make themselves full-time soldiers. Many of them do. Many of them are even kind of tricked into doing that even. So these are the people who were able to avoid all the various tricksiness that the Russian recruiters have been doing to push people into the war. And they're the ones that even avoided that. So they're not the most gung-ho soldiers in the Russian army is what I'm saying. And I think that leads to one of our first topics here is that so many of these Russians have been taken captive. What we do see coming out of Kursk Oblast that Ukrainian soldiers are sharing is these massive, massive rounds of Russian surrenders being packed into buses, into trucks to be sent back to Ukraine, back to prisoner of war camps. We saw this a lot in just that first day where they crossed the border. The Russian border guards immediately dissolved, all surrendered, and now here's dozens of people that we have to worry about. This could even be slowing down the offensive, dealing with all these prisoners. We then saw the Kedorovsky, the Akamats, who are formally part of the National Guard. These are the soldiers who are personally loyal to the dictator of Chechnya, but within the formal security structures, they count as a National Guard unit. They were sent as a reaction unit to this incursion into Russia, and it seems as soon as they got there, most of them surrendered. There's always the joke about them being the TikTok soldiers who don't actually do anything except, pose for the gram in Mariupol or something. But in this case, yeah, they're sent to fight, immediately gave up.
One interview with a captured Russian officer whose units were captured and they were operating in the same area as these Akhmat guys. His claim was that the reason there was this massive capture of all these Akhmat guys because the Chechen warlord, Kadyrov, has decreed that any POWs who return to Chechnya will be executed. As a result, whenever these guys encounter any sort of resistance, they all bolt to avoid being captured. Unfortunately, bolting to avoid being captured doesn't always work, and sometimes you just get captured, which is what happened with these Akhmat guys. While we don't know exactly how many were captured, on one video, there's easily 20 or 30 guys crammed into a single courtyard visible on the footage. And that's likely to be just one portion of the unit that was captured. So it's a significant amount of people.
There's also been some rumors and grumbling in the Russian Telegram war channels and all that about possibly this even being the Chechens coordinating with the Ukrainians in some way. And I think this is a pretty ridiculous claim. But if you look back to our previous episode where I was talking about the terror attacks in Dagestan and how right now the Russians are basically gutting the Dagestani civil service and hunting down people. There's a lot of distrust of North Caucasian people right now in Russia. Like beyond the baseline level of distrust and racism against North Caucasian Muslims, it is so much worse within the last month. So right now they are primed to believe the absolute worst about the Kedorovsky, which is good for us in that there is a lot of dissension and confusion in the ranks, though I would hate to be a random Dagestani or Chechen guy right now.
But as for the Akhmat guys, fuck them.
They deserve it. War criminals who are traitors to Chechnya. The real Chechen government is located in Kiev. Another topic we have to talk about, though, is the civilian response would be the mirror image of that. And because this took place on the opposite side of the border from Sumy, I think talking about Sumy is a good way to introduce this topic. During the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, Sumy was just on the opposite side of the border and was very quickly surrounded, buried deep behind enemy lines. Most of the countryside around Sumy was held by the Russians. All of the major roads into Sumy were controlled by the Russians. It was a city that was cut off, and it was a scary time. It was a city completely under siege.
Kiev was encircled and Kiev was under siege. Sumy was legitimately besieged. It was legitimately completely surrounded by the enemy.
And because of that, it became the city in Ukraine, I think, that is most associated with the territorial defense. The territorial defense at the time was basically a citizens' militia. There was some training leading up to the full-scale invasion. Like people could go to territorial defense offices and be taught how to do first aid or whatever, but it was mostly ad hoc civilian militia. And there was very, very little Ukrainian military in Sumy to defend anything. So it all came down to the territorial defense. Sumy Oblast was defended by its own people who took up arms, who did humanitarian aid, who drove into villages that were occupied by Russia to evacuate people or bring them supplies. The government had very little presence in Sumy Oblast at that time. It was all organized from the grassroots on up, which is why we now have to compare and contrast that with what the Russians are doing. The Russians were told to evacuate from the border areas of the Kursk Oblast, but were given very minimal support to do so. There were very few trains leading out. Tens of thousands of people have evacuated from this area, but it was all very ad hoc and received very little help in doing so. Thankfully, the Ukrainians had no interest in stopping them. But when the Russians were in position to stop refugees, they stopped them. Ukrainians aren't doing that.
On top of that, there has been no armed civilian response to the Ukrainian occupation. The Russian civilians don't care. There have been multiple videos on YouTube, and I will preface this by saying that the veracity and credibility of these videos are difficult to establish. They are typically of middle-aged men speaking Russian, claiming to be residents of this or that town in Sumy Oblast and speaking about the Ukrainian occupation. So, and again, there's no way to verify how credible or how true these videos are, but they've all been kind of selling the same message that the Russian citizens don't care who controls them because historically Russians have never ever had really a choice in leadership. So what does it really matter to them what flag flies over their city hall? And they see no reason to fight back. Their lives can't possibly get worse. They already live in Russia. And as a result, they have either been evacuating or sitting tight and just sticking their head under the sand and waiting for things to blow over. Unlike Ukrainians, where we saw a massive kind of grassroots movement of learn how to make Molotovs and learn the best way to disable tanks and to make tank traps. And there's been none of that in Russia. No one cares. Tank rolls into your town. Who gives a shit?
Yeah, we have to really look at the Russian propaganda at the beginning of the war for this as well, because what the Russians were saying was that the Ukrainians don't want to fight. Once we kind of knock down the leadership of the army, then everything else will fall into line because they're all secretly just Russians. But that seems to have been actually what happened in Kursk Oblast. Nobody is taking up arms to defend Russia. There's no popular resistance movement. There are no partisans. No nothing. Ukrainians fought, and Russians aren't. But then go to the civilian side of that by saying, like I said, we know that there was all these people that are trying to sneak their way into Russian occupied territory at the beginning of the war to help people escape, like this massive civil society movement to save and help whoever could be helped. We're not seeing any of that from Russia. We are not seeing Russian aid groups trying to go into Sudzha to make sure that whoever wants to get out can get out or to deliver food and water. No, not at all. Nobody cares. Nobody cares at all. They are completely cowed. And I say this as their enemy in this war, that I'd rather that they didn't put up a fight at all, obviously. But it's weird that they aren't.
To be honest, I think it's not that weird. Again, considering Russian history, for all of their talk of patriotism and respecting the motherland, we have to remember that this is an incredibly cynical and apolitical population. That was explicitly the deal that Putin offered the Russian populace. We'll take care of the economy and the government and everything else, and all you have to do is stay quiet and do your jobs. I'll handle everything else. Ignore whatever actions we take, whatever we say. Ignore our thieving. We'll keep it under wraps and we'll keep it just low enough that you can still see the benefits of a rising economy. Of course, that particular compact between Putin and the Russian people was broken with the full-scale invasion. So for all the praise that's been heaped on Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Russian Central Bank, she has only been able to kind of plug the gap by selling off Russia's foreign reserves, by just almost giving away oil and whatever schemes they can concoct to keep some sort of revenue going. The Russian economy isn't doing great, is the point. So that pact is gone. And the people, again, it's all of this patriotism, all of this I am Russian. It's all performative. It is, no one really cares. Russians are quite possibly one of the most apathetic nations on the planet. They have almost never had any true say in their government, not under the Tsar, not under the USSR, maybe for a year or two in the 90s. And then Putin came into power and that old system kind of reasserted itself. So from their perspective, as long as people aren't shooting above their heads, their lives are basically going to be identical. Underinvested, ignored, slightly resented for being such alcoholic, worthless peasants. The Russians have been used to this for literal centuries.
Comes to making appeals to the Tsar, that is the one thing that we have seen. We have seen videos of, get the whole village together where they say that, oh, we are good Russians who support the special military operation and are loyal to Putin, so why don't you come and help us?
Save us, dear Tsar. It's so funny how these videos, you can find the exact same genre of video of villages begging for Putin to fix the potholed roads leading to their town, or to build a new children's cultural center. It's given in the exact same way, with the exact same level of seriousness, which is very interesting considering one is, please give us some basic infrastructure, and the other is, we are being occupied by a foreign army. And yet, the method and presentation of the message being delivered is identical.
Russian civil society does not exist. Russian support for doing anything doesn't really exist. There's only loyalty to the Tsar and in exchange wanting something in return. In this case, they're not getting it, or often they don't, but they see it as a personal relationship between themselves and the Tsar, and they are blaming the problems only on local governments. I mean, it's the same story over and over again. It's always the local leaders to the problem, not the Tsar. Tsar, save us from the local leaders.
It is such a common and pervasive sentiment that there is a idiom for this in Russian. Царь хороший, бояре плохие. The Tsar is great, the boyars or the local aristocrats are the bad ones. That is how ingrained this instinct is in the Russian population.
But of course, this lack of any level of civil engagement seems to have a much darker side. And this is getting into territory that is less verified. It is much more based on rumor, but it does seem to be going around the Russian Telegram channel, so might as well bring it up, which is it seems as though the Russian security forces themselves are looting Russian villages after they have been abandoned and evacuated. There's one video especially that's going on, and again, everything is really shady, so who knows what is actually happening. Of one, it seems as though he's in the Ravsgardia, riot police basically, and saying how, the Ministry of Defense has already gone through there and picked it clean. So he wanted to loot, but the army had already been there to loot. At the beginning of the full-scale Russia invasion, there was a lot of suspicion of potential looters in Ukraine. You may remember videos of suspected looters getting beaten up in the street, and that led to a lot of negative PR for Ukraine. But whatever problem may have existed, I didn't really see much of anything beyond the first week, and we don't really know how big of a problem it ever was in the first place. The Russians seem to be just doing it to themselves as soon as they got the opportunity. But where are these evacuees going? And that's another thing that is very worrisome, is that the occupation authorities of the Zaporizhia region of Ukraine, the Russian quislings that run the occupied Zaporizhia region, have invited the evacuees from Kursk to live there. So these are people who very obviously did not want to be on the front line of a war. That doesn't mean they were against the war. They just didn't want to suffer any negative consequences from it, as one rarely would want to. So now that because this war is occurring and because they are running away from having fighting going on their streets, they're instead going to be sent to Zaporizhia to become colonial settlers in an area that is absolutely riddled with partisan warfare, and as bad as Russian governance is so much worse in the occupied territories. So being kind of forcibly transferred from Kursk, which was about as normal as you're going to get, to occupied Zaporizhia, welcome to the war. I don't know.
But aside from Russia's reaction, and again, they're in full panic. It's really hard to understate, or rather, it's really hard to overstate how much the Kursk offensive has taken them by surprise. They've really started pulling units from everywhere to reinforce the defenses. They've reportedly diverted about half of their operational air strength to amusingly bomb their own villages in Kursk that they believe to be occupied or held by Ukrainians. Because as we've repeatedly established, and as Russian history has repeatedly established, Russians don't really care about Russia that much. They say they do, and they'll trumpet it, but they don't really care about it that much. That's why they have widespread looting of their own people. That's why they are happy to authorize strikes on their own troop groupings. It's why they're happy to authorize airstrikes on their own villages within proper Russian territory. Of course, this is all good news for Ukraine. While we have no real idea of what the planning was like or what the operational strategic goals of the incursion are, thanks to the Ukrainians finally taking OPSEC very seriously. We can definitively say that it has turned the narrative of the war, at least in this chapter. Whereas prior to Kursk, the narrative was increasingly pessimistic. Ukraine is going to be trapped in this grinding attritional warfare, which we will continuously lose for the next 6 months, a year, for however long this war goes on. The Russians will be able to ground us down. Now everyone's talking about how brilliant the Ukrainian commanders are, how unprepared the Russians are, how embarrassing this is for Putin. It is just a massive, massive PR win on every single front.
Yeah, the one thing that we are seeing right now is, well, of course, on all parts of the front, we're getting reports of a huge boost to morale across the board. But if you're looking specifically at the soldiers involved in this invasion, the one thing that operational security allows us to see, which because it's the only thing we're really allowed to see, it's because that's the thing they want us to see. So take everything in stride. But we have seen so many videos coming out of the soldiers taking part of this incursion, just kind of being goofballs of them taking over some Russian command post, doing like a skit, doing some improv, making fun of the Russian forces, making fun of Shoigu, Gerasimov, like the famous phrase of, Shoigu, Gerasimov, where's my supplies? That joke has been made a dozen times by now. There's others of them just kind of strolling around villages and like telling villagers of, oh, everything's going to be fine. Just learn the Ukrainian anthem and vote for the referendum. As, a joke making fun of how the Russians would claim to hold, referendums in Ukrainian territory that were obviously nonsense. It's all a joke, so might as well treat it like a joke.
Hell, Ukrainians outside of the actual incursion forces have joined in, and they've started renaming Russian stores and Google Maps to the Ukrainian equivalents. So while you probably won't physically find an Atabe in Suja, you can at least see it on Google Maps.
Yeah, Ukrainians have a certain sense of humor that is not always fully understood by foreigners in the outside world. But it is very, very based on irony and sarcasm and dark humor, and it is in full display right now.
The only kind of thing that left to discuss here about Kursk, without obviously going there and seeing things with our own eyes, is what fallout this could have on Putin. And I've made this point before, Putin has very few constraints on his behavior. However, they do still exist. As few as they are. One of those constraints is protecting the territorial integrity of Russia itself. This is, while no one cares about Kursk, like really no one cares about Kursk, people in Kursk don't care about Kursk, it is still like Russian land. It's like indisputably a part of Russia. It's not Crimea or the Donbass or Zaporizhia or Kharkiv or Odessa or even Kiev. It is indisputably just a chunk of Russia. And the fact that he cannot properly defend it and that he cannot properly fight back the Ukrainians even after a week must be raising questions in his kind of constituency, in his base of power, the Siloviki, the security service class, basically the thug class, the goon class. These guys react to strength and power. And right now, Putin looks incredibly weak. He looks stupid. He looks slow. He looks old. And in a mafia society, all of those things can very well be death sentences.
You can say a lot of things about Putin's delivery, his kind of rhetorical skills. He's known for being very stone-faced and unemotional, though, as we've talked about with his historical addresses and such like that, he is prone to the crazy rants about stuff that no one fully understands. One thing that he is rarely, though, is visibly unsettled, possibly even scared. And in his address about how the Ukrainians are invading Russia. How dare they? You're not allowed to invade Russia. We're allowed to invade you. You're not allowed to invade us. This is a huge humanitarian tragedy. Why is no one listening to us?
The world reacting to the genocide of Russians and, of course, Oblast.
Not fair. Mods, help us, mods. He does seem actually shaken. He does seem actually uncomfortable, possibly even afraid. It's not supposed to go this way. We've mentioned the previous border incursions into Russia where some Russian volunteer unit would take over 3 villages on the other side of the border, then leave within a few days. This has always been seen as a bit of a PR stunt, and people thought this was a PR stunt at first. I thought it was a PR stunt at first, but it's not. It's an invasion of Russia, and Putin is handling it poorly, and he realizes he's handling it poorly, and everyone else is going to realize that he's handling it poorly.
In an attempt to kind of save face or reestablish some level of control over the situation, Putin has designated the area of the incursion as a quote-unquote counter-terrorist operation. What this means is that the responsibility for that operation's success is not given to the military. It is instead given to the Federal Security Service, the Russian FSB, because the FSB are the federal body with the authority over counterterrorism operations. This was done primarily because the army leadership has lost most of its credibility with Putin. Most of their promises have turned out to be hollow. Most of their victories have turned out to be lies or half-truths. And the enduring corruption underpins everything. While the FSB wasn't in Putin's good graces at the start of the full-scale invasion, after all, it was their faulty intelligence that led Putin to believe taking Kyiv would be a 3-day SMO. They have kind of regained their standing simply because the army has fallen, in his estimation. There must be some understanding by Putin that he's surrounded by not just incompetent idiots, but incompetent idiots that are actively feeding him bad, misleading, and false intel. And that must be playing some role in his decision-making. One of the benefits, of course, for Ukraine, for the FSB to be in charge of this area, is that, as I said, inter-service rivalries are incredibly high. The FSB is unlikely to cooperate well with the army elements operating in Kursk Oblast. And the FSB, there's a security service. They have been equipped with full military materiel, probably some of the better stuff that Russia still has available to it. But these are not soldiers. These are cops, feds, secret policemen. They're not soldiers. And while they may have been trained on whatever equipment they've been given, it's really unlikely that they have the expertise and coordination needed to operate all of these things effectively. So it may be that Putin has misstepped again by giving control of this defense to the FSB. Though, of course, if the FSB fails, Putin can say, well, you guys are all incompetent, and have the proper kind of backing to commit a purge.
As for what Russian propaganda is saying about this is pretty divided. On one hand, we have the issue with, like what Putin said, Ukrainians are invading our territory and everything's terrible, and why is the world not saving us from the evil Nazi Ukrainians? But if you would listen to some of the other more, especially English language Russian propagandists, and it is often the case that English language Russian propaganda is much more, sanguine than some of the stuff you find in the military telegram channels. And that is that apparently the very first day of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia completely destroyed the Ukrainian advance force. And even though apparently that attack continued, so obviously not completely destroyed. And every day they are telling how thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and all this equipment has been destroyed. And yes, there are some clashes. Soldiers are dying, but we do not see evidence of them even being stopped, let alone slaughtered, as though the Russians are talking about it. So as always, Russian propaganda is very, very stupid. Turn in next episode for a further investigation of that. And the last thing I'll say that will build on that is that Putin's reaction to this of treating the incursion into Kursk as like a special kind of catastrophe in its way has also entirely undermined their war propaganda regarding occupied Ukraine. According to the Constitution of Russia right now, there is no difference between Kursk Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblast. They're both, according to the Russian Constitution, according to Russian law, according to Russian propaganda, the same thing, except that Zaporizhia, the city of Zaporizhia, is still quote-unquote occupied by the Ukrainian military. They see the city of Zaporizhia as a part of Russia being occupied. So that should be a much bigger concern than some border towns in Kursk Oblast. That's not what they're saying. That's not what they're saying right now. There is a very obvious difference between Ukraine sending troops into Kursk Oblast and sending troops into Zaporizhia Oblast. That is obvious to us all of what that is. That obviously Zaporizhia is not Russia, so it's part of the war, it's part of the invasion, it's part of the occupation, while Kursk is part of actual real Russia. But Russia can't say that, because Russia already said that they're the same thing. So this throws all of that into question. And people have to be recognizing that as well on some level. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future. It seems as though Ukraine is reinforcing this incursion with more units, including units that are pretty well experienced and were serving on other parts of the front. This seems to be a pretty serious operation taking place. What happens with it, we don't know. Do they plan to hold territory? Kind of seems like it right now. Do they plan to take more territory? We'll see. But until then, we'll just have to watch. Again, the operational security and lack of information is very tight. So we can only hope that we get the information and hope that this operation achieves its goals and weakens the Russian war effort. That said, we'll now talk a bit about what is happening elsewhere on the front line. I'll start by saying that in the Kharkiv front and the Chasiv Yar front, there has been very little changes. It seems as though Kharkiv seems to be the main place where the Russians are drawing manpower away from in order to defend Kursk. A couple weeks back, I mentioned that the Russians did a breakthrough at Kupiansk, but had not really achieved much since then. At this point, this salient pointed towards Kupiansk has captured another village, and it looks like there could be a possible encirclement there, but that information has not updated within the last couple days anyway, so probably not. We also have to look at the New York front, New York and Toretsk. In a future episode, I will give more information about New York, but right now it is not fully captured yet, though I will say that most of the town has been captured by the Russians at this point. They have claimed at various points full control over New York, but that is not true. I expect it to be true within the next 2 weeks or so, though. The front there is not looking good. There is one other thing to say. If you look to the east of the city, that was the one part of the 2014-2015 front line that has not changed at all. And within the last 3 days, the Russians finally moved past that very old line of trenches and fortifications that have been there from the very start. So now there is no longer any part of the front line that the Russians have not moved beyond. If you looked at the Pokrovsk sector, which is the one thing that we have to worry about the most, the Russian advance there has continued. They are now hitting the town of Prodivka. If you recall, a few weeks ago, I said that I believed that the Pokrovsk direction would slow down after the Russians hit Prodivka. It is a larger town in the area. There is another line of towns to the south of it along a riverbank. There are rivers to the north and south of the city. Like I said, it's larger. There's probably more fortifications there. I'm hoping that this will slow down the advance in the Pokrovsk sector, but it hasn't. That slowing down has not happened yet. We'll see how this battle of Prodivka goes, but if that falls, Pokrovsk is next, and that is very worrying for the reasons that we've described about 3-4 weeks ago, I believe. And that is the general combat situation. It has all been one long combat update this episode, but we'll settle down with a lighter topic, which is the Olympics. This Olympics, the 2024 Summer Olympics, has been the smallest Olympics for Ukraine ever. Only 140 athletes went to Paris. Now, the reasons for this very small delegation are obvious if you think about them for just a couple of seconds. Ukraine is a country at war. A lot of Ukrainian athletes have joined the military, and a lot of the Ukrainian athletes have died in the military. There's one Alexander Pilashenko. He died on the front line in May. He was the 2-time European weightlifting champion. He could have gone on to Olympics and won some medals, but instead he died defending his country. There are stories of athletes being killed in training, being killed in the war, having to become refugees. So not a full complement of athletes this time around because of that.
So despite this being Ukraine's smallest delegation, it has actually been Ukraine's best Olympic result in 12 years. Ever since the start of the invasion in 2014, Ukrainian athletes have been consistently one of the faces of the country, which is obvious. There's a lot of Ukrainian athletes. Sport culture is very well developed here. You can throw a rock and hit a gym in every single neighborhood in the country. It's a really big part of Ukrainian lives. And being under threat and seeing one's colleagues and partners and friends be murdered by the Russians has had a motivating effect on Ukraine's athletes.
Yeah, I'll go down some of these Olympic winners, and I'll start by the women's saber team. Has not only been successful, they won gold, but for the last, especially within the last year, has been a major figure of Ukrainian resistance in the world of sport, which is often quite friendly to Russia. Olha Karlan is a extremely successful women's saber fencer. She has won 2 gold, a silver, and 3 bronze throughout her career. In this Olympics, her team the women's saber team won gold, and she herself won bronze. You may remember us talking about her before. So Olha had one incident where she refused to shake hands with her Russian opponent in a previous competition, Anna Smirnova. Anna Smirnova then basically lost her mind. She demanded that the judges strip Olha of her win, that she broke the rules by not shaking hands, when in actuality all she had to do was touch swords. That would have counted. The world of fencing, like many sports, and we'll be talking about this next week, spoiler alert, we'll be talking about some Russian corruption in the world of sport as well as misinformation in the next episode, but there was a big witch hunt against her that she eventually won. And that witch hunt was partially built up because of how much Russian control exists within sport. And her resistance to this became a big kind of propaganda win for Ukraine, in that we are the ones that followed the rules. We beat Russia. They tried to break the rules, go around them, and it didn't work. In addition to her just being an extremely famous athlete, very successful, there's a Barbie designed after her. So sport hero of Ukraine, Olha Karlan. Some other winners were Yaroslav Huchik for women's high jump, Alexander Kinsniak for men's middleweight boxing. Those are gold medal winners. For silver medal, there was Sergei Kulish in men's 50-meter air rifle, Ilya Kovtun, who Twitter thought that he was quite handsome, men's parallel bars, Arziv Nazibov, men's Greco-Roman wrestling in the 67-kilogram division, Ludmila Luzan and Anastasia Rybachuk in women's C2 500-meter canoeing, and Arina Kolyadenko in women's freestyle wrestling in 62 kilograms. Then in bronze, like I said, Olha Karlan, she won women's saber, and for this, Irina Herashenko in women's high jump, Mikhailo Kokhan, men's hammer throw, and finally, Jean Belanyuk, men's Greco-Roman wrestling in 87-kilogram weight division. He is a Rwandan Ukrainian man who is a sitting member of the ruling Servant of the People Party. Unfortunately, my favorite Olympic athlete did not make it to medaling. I have not recently been training in judo, but I like to think of myself as still being a judo guy. Once a judo guy, always a judo guy. So Daria Biladid is an extremely successful Ukrainian judoka. In the previous Olympics, she won bronze in the 48-kilogram weight division. She has since moved up to the 57-kilogram weight division. And in that division this year, she had won the Euro Championship. I'm pretty sure I talked about that I definitely talked about that on the pod about her winning that. I'm a big Daria Biladid fan. Unfortunately, she lost in the round of 16 to Haruka Funakobu of Japan, and Haruka then went on to win bronze herself. So that is the result of the Olympics for Ukraine. Again, smallest team, but very successful one. They really provided a boost to Ukrainian moods. A lot of these people are, very famous, a lot of support, and gave a bit of a respite from the war. So that will close out our episode. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, one way to support us is to go to patreon.com/UkraineWithoutHype and join our tiers of supporters and join our Discord channel. But I would also ask you to just tell your friends about us, like, subscribe, thumbs up, go to our various social media. We are on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, the whole suite of things. I would also like to take this time to promote a podcast by one of our patrons. The Beyond Barbarossa podcast by Scott Burry is an excellent review into the Second World War, and Romeo and I actually guested on episode 35 talking about modern perspectives of the war in Ukraine and Russia. So give that a listen to as well. And I would like to thank our wonderful supporters. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Randy McDerlin, Giorgio, Ivana Kokratskaya, David Shepard, Michael Drucker, Kat DeLath, Jacob Hohem, T. Bart, Laura De Leon, Devi, Grace Krause, Mike Perrone, Kevin Alberton, Anonymous, Etienne Soleil, Michael Wickman, Anna Karen Person, Jenny Louise, Jan, Barbara, Shieldwall, Marguerite, Melissa Koselko, Noam Hart, Sanjay, David Wall, Levy Grove, Scott Gengris, Chris Bennington, James Wise, Alex Grochmal, Daniel Spring, Dennis Napalm, Dmitry Letvin, Jerd, Silas Frank, Veronica, Ada McDonald, Vivek, Stuart Akers, Victoria Leontineva, Scott Tokaryuk, James Burke, Anastasia, Thomas Sobiek, Julia Lindsay, Captain Technical, Evelyn, PLM, Subtle Knife, Emily Bavona, Matt Miller, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Marianne Obbs, Dish Taco, Wandering Lens, RDK, Jared Bradley, Ursula, Christopher Yee, Francois, Lori Halila, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Lemonikin, and Demetrio Munez. Thank you all very much for your support. So until next episode, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!